Great, now I have to follow Margaret. Good morning. The gospel reading is part of a series of Jesus' instructions. Luke tells of hordes of people gathering to hear Jesus, but some of the message seems directed to the disciples. Last week, a man challenged Jesus to intervene in a family inheritance dispute, leading to a tale of the rich fool who falls in love with his huge harvest. Now he turns to his followers with a practical keep the faith. Is Jesus indulging in an overstatement when he talks of the owner of the slaves serving them their meal? And is there a picture Jesus serving his followers in the same way that he washed their feet? Let's listen closely for the good news for us in Luke 12, verses 32 to 40. Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Be dressed for action and have your lamps lit. Be like those who are waiting for their master to return from the wedding banquet, so that they may open the door for him as soon as he comes and knocks. Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes during the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves. But know this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour.
It isn't often that I invoke pastoral privilege. I think I've done that a couple of times in the past year or so. But I am doing that today as well. The passage that I'm going to be focusing on is coming from Luke chapter 8, verses 26 through 39. It is a gospel story that takes us north and east of Jerusalem to Gerasa, on the shore of the Lake of Galilee, where a tormented man confronts Jesus. And in the language of the day, the story revolves around the army of evil spirits inhabiting him, whereas today we might talk of schizophrenia. At Jesus' word, healing takes place, but the uproar is too much for a herd of pigs and too much for some of the local citizens who want nothing to do with this upsetting healer. So let us listen closely to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, beginning with the 26th verse. Then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. And as he stepped out on land, there met him a man from the city who had demons. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he lived not in a house, but among the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beseech you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many a time it had seized him, and he was kept under guard and bound with chains and fetters. But he broke the bonds and was driven by the demon into the desert. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. And they begged him not to command them to depart into the abyss. Now a large herd of swine was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him to let them enter these. So he gave them leave. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. When the herdsmen saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. And then people went out to see what had happened, and they came to Jesus, and they found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it told them how he had been possessed with demons, was healed. And then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. And the man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might not be with him, but he sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." And he went away, proclaiming throughout the whole city how much Jesus had done for him. The word of the Lord. Give praise and give thanks. Amen. Now, coming from, as I am, North Carolina, I would dare say that the North Carolinians would be shocked to hear of swine being drowned in a lake. What a waste for good barbecue. But on a more serious note, I share with you a story in hopes that the message will enter into your heart, give you something to ponder, and perhaps broaden your vision just a little bit. I apologize for talking so cryptically, but this is in response to, and I must say, this is not a criticism of the man, but a criticism of the words, a particular phrase that was used on Monday morning at the White House press conference. President Trump was giving his response to the gun violence that had occurred. And in the process of doing that, he talked about mentally ill monsters. Now, back in my undergraduate degrees, I had taken a number of religious studies courses, and one of those was from a Catholic priest who, and I forget what the subject of the class actually was, but on one of the topics talked about propaganda used to sway your mind, and he lifted up images of the Japanese that was published in newspapers and cartoons and whatnot during World War II, depicting them as demons. I mean, they had the horns on their heads and tails with pointy ends coming off. And it was all in an effort to, as he explained, to desensitize the American public, and particularly the soldiers that were going to fight, to remove the humanity from these people so that it would be easier to kill, to destroy them as the enemy. So this is where I'm coming from when I hear the phrase mentally ill monsters. I mean, the mentally ill are not monsters. They may at times have done monstrous acts of violence, but they themselves are human beings that are struggling with an illness that we cannot see, an illness that is of the mind. We hear that in the story from Luke as he lifts up the man from Gerasa. And I have had direct experiences with a situation that leads us into this conversation. 21 years ago, I was in my third year of ordained ministry in a rural community in Illinois, and had heard that a son of one of the fathers of the church, one of the elders of the church, was returning from Montana. At that particular time, I had attended various meetings and topics which discussed the right-wing militias that were being formed in these rural western portions of the country. And my immediate response was, how long has he been in Montana? What is his motives for returning? And I was ready to prepared to do judgment on the young man. His name, and I often don't use real names, but I think in this case it is necessary, was Rusty Weston Jr. He had been confirmed in our church, but had left, was not active, and like I said, had been living out of state, but had returned home briefly. But I hadn't had the opportunity to meet him. I knew his father and his mother and his grandmother very well because they were active within our congregation. But I can recall a Friday evening about this time of year, returning home from going out to dinner, and the telephone was ringing. This was before cell phones. And I picked up the phone, and one of our members said, "You've got to get down to the Weston house right away. There's been a shooting." So without further information or investigation, I thanked the person and got in the car and drove down into the Mississippi bottoms where there was a police barricade. And I identified who I was, and they moved the barriers and permitted me to pass through to continue down to the Weston farm. I arrived there, and there were several police cars with the lights flashing, and several unmarked cars, and there were police officers and plainclothesmen that were coming in and out of the house. And so I got out of the car, and one of the officers came up to me again. I identified who I was, and they said, "The Westons are in the living room." So I entered into the living room, and Russell Sr. and his wife were sitting there in tears. They said, "Rusty got up this morning, packed his guns in the truck, drove to Washington, D.C., and shot and killed 2 of the guards in the National Monument, in the National Capitol." How could this be? They said, "Well, Rusty has been diagnosed with schizophrenia for some years. And he came back, he got off his medication because he seemed to be stable. He thought that he was okay. And we knew that there was a problem when he began shouting at the TV because the TV was talking to him, telling him that President Clinton had sent the Secret Service down over the railroad tracks and were hiding there waiting to shoot him. And that he apparently felt the need to take his guns to Washington, D.C. to defend himself. Rusty was a child of the church. Maybe not active, but he wasn't a monster, even though what he did we could very easily call monstrous. His father that night wrote a statement. I was with them till 2 a.m, and then he called me at 9 a.m. and said he hadn't slept much all night, but he had a statement that he wanted me to read to the press. And so I went back down into the bottoms and went through the barricades again and received his legal pad of 2 pages and went to where the press had gathered at the barricade and told them that I had a statement from the father of the shooter and read that to them. And in that was a heartfelt message of grief and sorrow for what a son had done, acknowledging the love for the son, but not the love for the deed. For the deed he identified as being despicable and atrocious, and that he grieved with the families of the killed guards as well. There was more ramifications that occurred in the congregation as the days went by. Things that I hadn't anticipated. You know, that Saturday afternoon, I called the conference minister. And I said, you haven't heard, or maybe you have, but this is what's going on down at my church. What do I do? And he said, I don't know. I've never been in a situation like that before. I don't know if he would say that today. I mean, things have changed so dramatically in the past 21 years. And as a pastor, I found I had to wear several hats. I had a wedding planned that afternoon at the church. And so suddenly moving from counselor to supporting a grief-stricken family, I was in the midst of a family celebrating a new life together in union with one another. I mean, how do you put your heart into something like that after coming away from the devastation of a family? But bottom line, the church responded. In some ways, not so well, but in other ways, good. I mean, they were a faithful body of Christ. And what happened after that was people coming forward from the congregation and from the community to me, becoming the confessor, as they confessed to me that they had mental illness. Depression, manic depression, all different types. And we formed a group to support one another. The difficulties that the church had was how on a day-to-day basis do you respond to something like this? And I'm not sure any congregation would be ready to move forward into that. But as we move forward in our faith, we celebrate the fact that Christ can heal. And part of the healing that is to occur in this nation is to remove the stigma of mental illness. Because it isn't a monstrosity, but rather it is an illness of the mind that can be diagnosed maybe not cured, but there's a lot of illnesses we have that can't be cured right now. But with medication and counseling, the individuals that are dealing with this crisis in their lives and the families around them can find stabilization and support. And so I believe that Christ calls us as a body of faith to give that stabilization and that support wherever it may occur, and lift up the praise and love of God in that midst. Amen.